Okay, so hello and welcome to this session called Blazor and Bot Framework on Microsoft Teams Platform Dream Team. My name is Tommy Gölles. All the details are on the slide, and with me in the call is my colleague Stefan. Hey, Stefan. To give you a more convenient context, for us it's now 1 p.m. right after a lunch break. Wherever you are, in what time zone. So I hope you already enjoyed parts of the Teams Nation today. And we will focus today on two parts of Teams development, namely how to develop Teams applications with .NET and Blazor. That will be my part, and Stefan will talk about the bot framework and how to use Composer to create a bot. Little bit of housekeeping. We have a couple of slides that we try to go through in 4 to 5 minutes. Rest of the session is two big demos. I will post the link to the slide deck in the chat during Stefan parts because there are a couple of links in there, and you should hopefully find those links. The information that is linked there. So we will post that. No need to take screenshots. You will get the whole package anyways. And as I've read already, there will be a recording laterwards also, so you can concentrate on the content that we try to deliver now. So let's begin with a little bit of an introduction and context setting. Of course, influenced by what we got from Microsoft, because we're doing this session most of the time with a colleague from Microsoft. So hi, Walter, if you see that, thanks for your help. The slide deck starts with a more general question or more general approach. So let's imagine for a second you have a workplace that allows you to communicate efficiently. Of course, all the things that we are talking now in the next minutes are on top of the Teams platform. So communicate efficiently inside your Teams environment. You would be able to stay in the know around or about tasks that are on top of minds on your daily agenda of your team, of your department, of your company, and you can reach everything inside of Teams. You can find experts like we used to do maybe with the SharePoint people search. Of course, now same capability in terms of third-party integration, but the UI to integrate and to actually find experts directly in Teams. Or you could share ideas directly in your Teams client. Or another one, you could even track progress within an adaptive card. If I'm correct, there should have been a session right before us. I'm pretty sure awesome content about adaptive cards. This would be another example of how those cards can be leveraged inside a personal chat, a group chat, or a channel conversation. And then, of course, also be able to capture feedback. Right-hand side, you see a screenshot of a mobile application. So also using the capabilities of the Teams platform to deploy your solution to Android and to iOS to be mobile first in that kind of scenario. And then other screenshot, of course, also to integrate maybe Power BI to really get the depth of Microsoft 365 and to leverage all the services and make them visible and work together nicely inside the Teams platform. Of course, what we are using or what we are building on top of is in order to get data from Microsoft 365, the Microsoft Graph. It's not the only place that you can get data, of course. We will also talk about integrating third-party applications, APIs, because that's the nature of the game. Only parts of your data resides in Microsoft 365 for a couple of applications at least. It's always depends on the setup, but we are expecting that customers in their projects, of course, also need data from third-party applications. From the data level, a little bit on top, we are using tools from Microsoft like Fluent UI, like the Graph Toolkit, like adaptive cards, like the bot framework, like Teams FX, what we're focusing on today, to then create experiences in Teams, Viva, SharePoint, and Office, and then, of course, to reach all the different platforms. If we're focusing on Teams, and that's what our goal for today is, we have a broad set of capabilities how to develop for the Teams platform. So in the center of this slide, you see all the current capabilities that we can create. The feature set that is there is a bot, a message extension, task modules, all the different types of application or features you can create. And then in this half circle, you see the different tools, the different application frameworks or technologies that are available to us, speaking of Teams development. And then, of course, it's a question of what are you capable of really using in terms of are you fit in web technologies and you can really create your stuff on your own without the need of a framework, just by integrating the Teams JavaScript SDK. We will focus on that today in the Blazor part. Then, of course, you can create Teams applications on top of SharePoint framework. You can create awesome applications on top of the Power Platform. And what I want to emphasize on this slide is it's a question of tool. And in our experience, it's most of the time for our consulting company, not a question of what are we capable of, but what is the team capable of that we will hand over the project to. So we skipped a little bit over the last 10 years, not so to have in the focus what we are capable of in terms of technology, but more to orient our deliverables on what is the team that operates, that runs the system, that bug fixes maybe afterwards, or that creates future PRs to the tool. What's their skill set? And that's the decision matrix we like to use in terms of, is it web technology? Is it SharePoint framework? Is it Power Platform? We don't see that as a, yeah, sometimes it feels if you watch conversations on Twitter or on LinkedIn, like someone like a religious question. That's not us. It's just a tool, and there are different scenarios where there's a different fit for different tools. With that short introduction, I would like to hand it over to Stefan so that you can showcase your bot with the Composer.
Thanks, Tommy. And what we're going to do in the next couple of minutes is we try to achieve the same result. So I'll build a bot based on Composer, and I'll use the Microsoft Graph to achieve a certain scenario, and Tommy then will do the same thing. Basically, the output will be the same for both scenarios, but he will use Blazor and he will visualize the whole thing as a Teams application. So if you're not familiar with Composer, a short introduction to what Composer is. Composer is a UI wrapper on top of the Microsoft Bot Framework SDK. So with Composer, you get a visual authoring canvas for building bots, which is especially helpful when you're not a pro dev, but for instance, you're a power user or you're an IT pro or whatever, and you want to build a bot, but you don't have the knowledge of how to really write code, then Composer is the right tool for you because it allows you to visually, within a graphical user interface, offer your bot, author the dialogues, include business logic. And if you'd like to, you can then even hand off what you have built in Composer to a developer, and the developer can then extend the bot using, for instance, C# or JavaScript. So I've already created a sample bot for today's demo, so I won't create a new one. If you would create a new one, you get a lot of templates which you can pick and choose from empty bot to what's called the Enterprise Assistant bot, which comes out of the Virtual Assistant template. We won't create a new one in sake of time. I've already done that. I've already created an empty bot for this demo, and the empty bot is pretty empty. It comes along with a greeting trigger, so that each and every user who enters the conversation with the bot, no matter if it's a one-on-one chat, if it's in a group chat, or if it's in a conversation, if you'd like to, will be greeted. And then the other thing is that whenever a user says something, it goes into the unknown intent trigger, and the bot will respond to, sorry, I didn't get that. And what I added already to test if LOUIS is working, LOUIS is the language understanding service in Azure to provide language understanding, is I've created or added the help trigger which gives me back, I'll help you wherever I want, wherever I can. So I've nothing done fancy with that bot. I can start the bot right away. And that's a really cool thing about Composer, because I don't need to leave Composer to build or test or even deploy my bot. So I can stay in Composer while building it. Whenever I feel I want to test it, I'll just start my bot right within Composer. Then I have an option to open up a web chat pane in here, which is basically bot framework web chat natively integrated into Composer. And then I can go ahead and write and communicate with my bot and test if my bot can help me or not, and if the things I've built in Composer are working out as expected. But that's a really, really short intro to Composer. And what we want to achieve in the next couple of minutes is that we want to build a bot, or we want to integrate a new dialog, which actually calls the Microsoft Graph to retrieve certain information about me as a user. So for instance, the teams I'm either a member or owner of, so my joint teams, there's a certain endpoint for that in Microsoft Graph. And we want to visualize that using an adaptive card. So the first thing we need is, whenever we're building a bot within Teams, it's about authentication, right? So we want to know who is the user, who is using the bot, or who's communicating with the bot right now. So whenever you're building a bot for instance, a web chat scenario, authenticated scenarios might not be as important as if you're building an enterprise wide bot, sitting in Teams, communicating with users, and then maybe reaching out to different APIs on behalf of the user to retrieve certain information, like the Microsoft Graph. And in those cases, we want to know, or we need to know actually who the user is to retrieve that certain information from the graph, for instance. So the first thing we need, and the first thing we want to do basically, is we want to build, or we want to integrate authentication into our bot. And in order to do so, what I'm going to do is I'll add a new dialog to my bot, and I'll simply call that Oauth dialog, for instance. And within that dialog, the dialog is pretty empty, so no actions are in there. The dialog won't do anything yet. But what I want to do and what I want to achieve within that dialog is I want to make sure that the bot will authenticate the user using Azure AD. And to do so, Composer actually has a pretty cool pre-built feature in there, or action as it's called, which is under access external resources, and there's an action called OAuth login. And OAuth login basically lets me integrate the whole logic of authenticating a user, but I don't need to even write a single line of code. I don't need to deal with authentication providers and stuff like that. I just consume that action, which is already pre-built for me. So I'll add that action into my OAuth dialog. And what I need basically is I need to provide just one thing. And that one thing is called the connection name. And you might wonder, what is a connection name? So we'll need to switch over to the Azure portal, because each and every bot in the backend consists of at least one Azure AD app registration. And I have my bot open right now. So this is my bot. I've already provisioned an Azure bot instance in my Azure portal. And each and every Azure bot comes with an Azure AD app registration. So we'll take a look at the Azure AD app registration, which is that one. And that basically is capable of handling authentication, not only for bots, but for every application you build on top of the Microsoft 365 platform when it's about connecting your app with Azure AD to retrieve certain authentication scenarios. And in there, we basically, can select which type of permissions this application should get. Like we want to have a mail read-write permission. We want to make sure to view the user's basic profile. We want to make sure to read the names and description of teams the user is a member of. And we want to, for instance, read the user's full profiles. And most importantly, we want this app to be allowed to sign the user in on his or her behalf. So basically, what you define in here are the permissions which your app will get via the Azure AD authentication flow. And then going back to my bot again, I have, on top of just provisioning the bot, I've already also created a new what's called Oauth Connection setting for my bot for the service provider Azure Active Directory. And this basically refers to my Azure AD app rack in the backend. So the thing we have seen a few seconds ago. So what I've done, basically, I've connected my Azure AD app registration with my Azure bot to make sure that my Azure bot is capable of consuming the APIs I've added to my Azure AD app registration via this app registration. And I've assigned a name to that specific OAuth connection setting, and that's AAD SPI. And I'll copy that name and I'll paste in the name into the connection name, because that's exactly what I need in terms of connecting the dots together. And as you also see, whenever a user is triggering that OAuth login action, the token which will retrieve from that authentication flow will be stored in a property, in a variable which is called turn.token. So we can refer to that token afterwards. And that's basically it to implement authentication using Composer. I'll just end that dialog properly, but I'm done with that dialog, and authentication should work. Now, the next thing is we want to basically make sure that this dialog will also be used. So we'll add a new trigger to the bot, and the trigger type is, of course, intent recognized. So we'll bring language understanding into the game. We'll say we want to name this trigger get my team's details, for instance. And I've already prepared a lot of trigger phrases on my smart cheat sheet, like whenever the user says something like list my teams or list my joint teams or show my profile or whatever, this trigger will be triggered. And then the business logic within that trigger will run. And in order to be super consistent with my dialog concept, I'll go ahead and begin a new dialog from that trigger, because I don't want to pack all the business logic into my root dialog, but I'll create a new dialog. And for the sake of simplicity, I'll give it the same name as before, but just append dialog. And in there, the whole magic happens. So we have a new dialog, which is about getting the user's team's details. And the output we want to achieve is we want to basically send out an adaptive card, which contains at least the user's display name, the user's email, for instance, and the count of teams the user is a member of. But the first thing we need, obviously, is we need to know who that user is. So we need to, again, make use of the already added OAuth dialog to make sure that if the user is not logged in, the OAuth login dialog will trigger, the authentication flow will start, the user needs to log in and authenticate, and then we could basically go ahead, because by then we have all the necessary details coming from our Azure AD app registration, which is the token, the authentication token, which is a bearer token, to, for instance, connect to the graph. And Composer has a lot of options to access external resources. Like one of them is send an HTTP request, and we'll do so. And it's pretty easy to send an HTTP request. We just need to make sure that we select the right method. We then select the right URL, which is in case https graph.microsoft.com v1-me-join teams to get my joint teams as a user. And in order to get my joint teams as a user, we need to fill in two headers. We first of all need to make sure that we accept application JSON as a result. And we also need to make sure that we send the authentication token along the way. And to do so, we add an HTTP header with key equals authorization. And we then refer to the token property we got in our OAuth dialog. Remember, the result of the OAuth dialog action is stored in a property called turn token. And to get the actual value of the token, we need to refer to turn.token.token, which is the actual value of the mirror token, which we can then send along the way. And to make sure that everything is persisted during that or after that HTTP call, the result is stored in a property called turn.results. So what we can do to test that out is simply sending a response. And within that response, we will refer to that turn dot, where is it? Let's say we don't want repeated IDs, but we want to send that turn dot result. And we can restart the bot. And I hope that authentication goes through even on the local web chat pane. If not, we can right away go to Teams, but we'll test that out if it works even without any without the use of Teams already. So I've just restarted the bot. It takes a couple of minutes, or not minutes, but seconds to reload everything. And then I can go ahead and test it again in my web chat. And if I now say, show me my join Teams, for instance, the first thing, okay, it's not working in Composer. OAuth activities are not yet available for testing in Composer. But what I could do is I could switch to Teams directly, because I've already, for the sake of simplicity, set up a Teams application to test and debug everything. So I can directly connect to my bot using Teams, use it via ngrok. So basically what it should do is it should route the thing which I have set right now to my bot locally. And as I can see, there's, oh yeah, it crashed. Doesn't matter. We will test it out after we've built everything in there anyways. So I'll delete that action again, because we don't only need the join Teams, but we need a couple of more pieces of information to make make our adaptive card look beautiful. First, we obviously need to get some parts of the user's profile. We could again go ahead and send an HTTP request, graph.microsoft.com/me, but we can also use a package which you can install in Composer via the package manager, focusing just around the Microsoft Graph. So in here, I get a new pane, Microsoft Graph, and in there I found a lot of helpful things around the Microsoft Graph and the actions the Microsoft Graph and the API endpoints it offers me. And the only thing I need to do then, because I don't even need to know the exact URL for that endpoint, I just say I want to get the signed in user's profile. I want to store that in dialog.userprofile, and the token value sits in turn.token.token, and that's it. So I don't even need to know if it's a get or post request and what the headers are. I'll just use the graph action to do so, and I can even do the same to retrieve the user's profile picture, which is with that action fairly easy. With just using HTTP request, it's a bit harder. So again, I store that in a result property, turn.token, turn.photo, the token sits in turn.token.token, and the user ID is whatever I've got back in my previous get the signed in user's profile action .id. That's it. And with that, what I can do is I can set a couple of properties which we'll need later on. So I can set, for instance, the user's display name, which sits in dialog.userprofile.display name. Same goes for the email address, which sits in the same property. I can go on and say I want to get the Teams count, which sits in the result property of our HTTP request. And I can use what's called language generation and adaptive expressions to dynamically count the values in there with a count function. So Composer makes my life pretty easy to manipulate properties on the fly as well. And then what I can do is I can even set the property as an adaptive card, or vice versa. I can set an adaptive card as a property. And the adaptive card basically looks like this. So the payload of the adaptive card makes sure that we can render an image, that we can render a display name, an email address, and the count of the teams of that user. And we do so by just using placeholders. So we basically refer to the user's teams count by using dollar curly brackets user.teams count, curly brackets closed. And that's basically the same notation as what Composer uses for language generation. So whenever that specific attribute or property is set in memory, it will be replaced by the actual value. So whenever user.teams count is set to, I don't know, 12, this will be replaced dynamically when sending out the adaptive card with 12 instead of dollar curly brackets user.teams count. So we can insert values and properties dynamically using the adaptive expressions language. And then if we have prepared everything, what we can do is we can send out our adaptive card, which sits in a property which sits in a property called dialog.profileCard. So this is the payload with the things we have in there defined and the placeholders we have defined, like user.display name and so on and so forth. And then we can go ahead and send out a response, but the response type won't be text. The response type will be attachment, and it will be an adaptive card. And we can get rid of the default adaptive card, and we'll just, cast the string of our adaptive card, which sits in dialog.profileCard, into a valid JSON object, and then send it out. So basically, we're using again a pre-built function coming from the LG language, which is JSON, to cast a string or whatever object into a JSON object and send that out. And we can then get rid of the text attachment, and we can restart our bot. And then we could make sure and see if it's working right in Teams as well. So we'll give it a couple of seconds, and I'll just, for the sake of simplicity, copy some phrase from our utterances in there. First, I'll say help if that works. No, it's not. Doesn't come along the way, which is weird. Let's see. Oh no. Yep, there you go. And just to demo, I've run ngrok on my end, so it basically creates a tunnel from my computer to the Azure service to make sure that I can run my bot locally, but still be able to test and debug in Teams. And if I now go ahead and list my joint teams, what it should do in the first place is it should ask if I'm already authenticated or not. Going back to Composer, the first action of that dialog would be the Oauth dialog. The Oauth dialog is configured in a way that it doesn't prompt for authentication whenever the user is already authenticated. And as you can see, if I scroll up, I've already tested the bot a couple of times. So I'm already authenticated on my machine. So I've already consented to the API permissions and all of that good stuff. So I won't be again asked to be authenticated. We could, for the sake of testing, implement something like a new trigger called logout. Say we want to log out. And if I submit that trigger, what I could do is basically I could say sign out user, send a new response. You are signed out. Restart my bot so we can even test it if the OAuth action is working properly or not. So if I now go ahead and say or input into the text field log out, it should sign me out. And then if I say list all my teams, it should ask me to authenticate again. So we'll give it a couple of seconds before we can test it in Teams again.
We might need to add to your demo a web service call to get the local time, so you're not forgetting that I also have a demo.
You still have 20 minutes left, which is good. So if I now go ahead and say log out, the bot will log me out, hopefully. I forgot the connection name, obviously. And the connection name was AAD SPI. Restart. And the user ID should be correct. Yep. And if it loads, I say log out. And then I can say list my teams. Oops, without the weird formatting. And what it should do now is it should present me, and I don't know what's the issue with that empty button, but it points to token.botframework.com. I open that up, get the usual login screen, sign into my account, and then I should retrieve the exact same card as before. My name, my email address of that demo user, and the count of joined teams right away. So even authentication works without a hassle. And with that, we are through with my demo, and I'll hand it back over to you, Tom.
Perfect. If you have a look at the chat, there is a question about updating adaptive cards with Composer. Maybe you can answer that during my part. At least I promise that anyway. So
yeah, sure.
Thank you for that. Back to my machine. I just need to move around a couple of windows here. We will open now Visual Studio 2022 in order to create a simple tab that basically does the same thing that Stefan showed you. So that gets my profile picture and an email address. Before we actually dive into that, if you want to follow that through, and if you also want to create that experience yourself, please make sure that you're using Visual Studio or Visual Studio, not only Enterprise, but any version 2022 with the version 17.1.0 and upwards. The part is available since, I think, February 15, because since that date, you are able to select down there Microsoft Teams development tools in the installer, which is a prerequisite. So open that up, Visual Studio installer. This is a major version, so it's not a preview version of the Visual Studio environment, but the Teams toolkit is still in preview, and you can install it with the click of this checkbox here. If you do that, you can open up Visual Studio. Let's do that. And there was a different version to do that, or a different type of Teams FX in 2019. So please stick with the newest version. That's the best idea or the best way for the future. We want to create a new project, and I select Microsoft Teams application. And this solution or project type is available because I already installed the component. So you need that in order to have this available here. And if I click on next, I can say, let's call that Teams Nation demo. And make sure we add the year, because you never know what's in my repo folder already. I click on create, and then I'm already presented with a small wizard that already is part of Teams FX. I can select here the tab experience. In previous versions, I was also able to select a bot part here that was moved away in the last version, but it will be there in the future when there is a GA or later word on, because the team did some re-architecturing on how Teams FX actually works, because Teams FX, the a Microsoft Teams framework is two things. It's something that is for TypeScript, Node.js development, and there is TeamsFX for .NET using Visual Studio and .NET. So don't get confused with the naming. There are two different things. TeamsFX is more the umbrella wording, and then there is TeamsFX for JavaScript, and then there's TeamsFX for .NET. Important step, choosing an account. I will choose my developer account, meaning account of the Microsoft 365 developer program. Please, if you don't have one, create one. It's a great initiative from Microsoft that allows you to create a tenant. And most important for this screen, your account, if you're using the developer program, is already a global admin, because this account actually needs permissions to create an Azure AD application and needs permissions to create a Teams developer manifest in the Teams developer portal. I click on create now, and this will take a couple of seconds because in the background, the scaffold is not only happening that the scaffolding takes place from Visual Studio now, but it also creates artifacts in my AD environment. And we will have a look at what it created, because down there, I can change the output to Teams Toolkit. Nope, Teams Toolkit was my selection. Here we are. And you see that it already created client ID, identifier ID, a bunch of stuff that's needed for authentication in my tenant. So with my user, that's everything that we got from the dialog up front. Teams ID, client ID, all those nice things that we need actually to work with Teams or to talk to the Microsoft Graph there. From here, Visual Studio or the solution greets you with a nice getting started text. And the first thing that we will do immediately is this: press F5, because we want to test what's called the F5 experience. So debug, start debugging. First time takes a couple of seconds, opens up a browser. Here we are, already connected to my tenant, because of course I did that already previously. So the first time it will ask you for your account. So please reuse the account that you used to authenticate or to configure TeamsFX in the wizard, because it should be the same, of course. Installation screen, I click on add, and I will add my static tab now. Takes again a couple of seconds, and then we will see some artifacts over here. So congratulations, Thomas Goddess, your app is up and running in your local environment. You can see Visual Studio, local debugging, and TeamsFX takes care of all the registration part in Azure, takes care of all registration part in the Teams developer portal, and you can start actually developing at the get-go. We will get one step closer to what Stefan showed in the demo, because right now I'm looking at a Teams tab that already knows my name, but my Bearer token, the first authentication token, is already present. But with this token, I cannot actually talk to the Microsoft Graph. For that, I need to click Authorize down there. And as we created a new Azure AD application, Teams Nation demo, so the same name is used, I need, of course, to consent that. Again, because I'm a global admin on my Microsoft developer tenant, I can consent on behalf of my organization. I click on accept, and what you will see is there my picture and my email address. And how is this working behind the scenes? First of all, if you're familiar with Blazor, you see here a typical structure of a typical Blazor project. So we have a page here and we have a tab here, and this tab actually is configured in my Teams manifest file. So there is a manifest file on the top here that basically is created through the scaffolding process, and you will see a reference down here to a static tab to my local host with a tab endpoint, and the tab.razor is a route configured in the Blazor framework to surface that page. From there, it's a simple div with just welcome. So welcome is already a custom element because it's a component. I can open up welcome over here, and there you see why actually why I really like to work with Blazor, because Blazor means you can take C# to the front end. We are using Blazor Server in that version. The team is already working on making that available also through WebAssembly, so that you can create both flavors of Blazor in order to get started with Teams. And one more thing, if you start creating Teams application, there are basically two paths, meaning you either start greenfield and your application or your project is the first thing in order to create a service, or there is already an existing service and you want to teamify that. The library TeamsFX takes care of both scenarios. Just with the scaffolding, it creates everything on the get-go, and you can press F5. If you want to start custom, just add the NuGet packages and you're good to go. But how is the graph thingy actually working? Down there you see there is a reference to the graph component. That's also somewhere here. Here we are. And from here, very, very basic, we see here a get token async method provided by what's called the Teams user credential class. And this class actually is provided by the TeamsFX library. So you don't need to create any authentication parts on your own. You're already provided by TeamsFX with all the needed methods. You just need to call get token async. The exception handling here is basically the logic that takes care of, is the application already consented? If not, we get called to get consent. And if you're consented and the credential is good, we call get graph service client. And if we go to that method here, you see, in the end of the day, we are creating a normal .NET graph service client. So from the graph.NET library, just a regular .NET client, but by the use of a specific provider that's again provided to you by TeamsFX. So you can copy that line basically in your own application. It's just a blueprint or an example, a sample how authentication can happen. We get back the graph client, and from there it's easy. We just call graph me request get async, and we get the profile back, meaning in that case the email address, and then of course also the user. User picture is a little bit tricky because it's a base 64 encoded string. So there is a method in between that already takes care of that decoding of that string so that we get a nice picture. And in Blazor, we just hand over that information to our next component, the profile card, with our profile information and our user photo URI. And if I open up the profile card, that's basically the HTML you saw in the demo part with my picture and my little card in there. Again, that's the beauty of Blazor. We are mixing front-end HTML with C#. Maybe if you are level deep in JavaScript, then look at TeamsFX from the Node and TypeScript side. But if you're coming from a .NET background, this really enables you to create Teams experiences just by using C#, what you probably already are familiar with. And then, of course, you can use all the features from the Teams SDK, because in the end of the day, what's technically happened behind the curtains is that this Blazor library uses the Teams JavaScript SDK and uses a feature called JavaScript interop from Blazor. So you take the methods that you want to integrate from the SDK, and TeamsFX on a higher level, on a very high level, maybe oversimplifying stuff here, is basically a .NET wrapper for that JavaScript library. So if you want to go deep and want to add some special things in there, you can also reuse your JavaScript code and just also make a .NET wrapper for it and point that in your root folder. So that's it from a very high level. TeamsFX, I can only encourage you to go to GitHub and search for TeamsFX. There are issue lists. There is the code that you can follow through. And again, very important, what you saw or in the last demo here, TeamsFX is still in preview. It's not G8. It's not general available yet. So play with the technology with keeping the future in mind. First version is targeted around the build time frame. So that's the goal of the product team at the moment. Of course, we all know first version and then we'll get better, but just to give you a glimpse on what will be available in terms of using .NET and using TeamsFX also to create experiences within Teams. Okay, with that, again, please check out the slide deck. We are part of the PNP group, so there is a lot of communication going on through the various channels. And as we told you, there are all the links in there. And I think that's it. So please rate our session. Thank you for your attention. I highly recommend to come back in 50 minutes because Rick will show you how to use audio and video in bots after us. Yeah, thanks, Stefan, and thanks, Thomas, for the moderation.